Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our good friend, Therese Taylor Stinson. Therese is a writer, spiritual director, ordained deacon, and ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church USA. A graduate of the Shalem Institute and a member of the Shalem Society for Contemplative Leadership, she is also the founding managing member of the Spiritual Directors of Color Network. Teresa is the editor of a award-winning collection called Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Down, and co-editor of Embodied Spirits, Stories of Spiritual Directors of Color. Teresa also contributed a chapter to our How Do You Heal or Advise book. Thank you very much. And her recent book is Walking the Way of Harriet Tubman, Public Mystic and Freedom Fighter. Teresa has also served many years as a spiritual director at the Wild Goose Festival. And all of this is a second career for Therese, following or along with her work in the medical field and for the federal government. You can learn more about her most recent book, the Harriet Tubman book, at broadleafbooks.com. So, Teresa, thanks so much for joining us. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be with you. And it's Therese. The E is silent at the end. But the way my mother pronounced my name was Therese.
Good. So is there anything else that you'd like people to know about you?
You called everything that's been happening since I retired as a second career. I'm not sure I consider it a career, but I do, I'm a big fan of Howard Thurman, and I do find it being truer to myself. And the part about a very young teenager, I'll say, after reading some books, I was in high school, maybe about 10th grade or so, reading some books, reading about Huckleberry Finn and such people, and then being asked to write essays about my reading. So I would do some of that, and I would write poetry and share with my friends and everything. And it seemed to be very well accepted by them. And so I imagined myself one day being a writer. And maybe coming from my family first was like, oh, no, you don't want to be a writer. You have to eat. So, maybe you want to consider something else before that. Well, when I entered the University of Maryland College Park, the summer after my first semester in college, I took a creative writing class because I like to do that, but also I thought it would be easy for me to bring my grade up a little bit with that too, because it was something that I've been doing a great part of my life already. And so I was in this creative writing class, summer class of creative writing, and the professor would tell us about some area of writing, and then ask us to go home and write something. And then we would come back to the next class and present it to the class. And so, this was in the 70s. And so I was very much involved in civil rights kinds of things. And actually, so was University of Maryland College Park. We were the first cohort of a good group. Now I won't say that was that large, because College Park campus is pretty huge. So, but there were 300 to 400 or so African American students, most of us from either Baltimore or DC, but some coming from California or Florida or someplace like that. And we would have people like Angela Davis and Francis Welsing, and I can't think of everybody's name at the moment, but we would have many of those people come onto campus and talk to us about what was going on. So I was very much engaged in that. And also, even before that, in my home, we talked about it. We saw things on the news. Neighbors would come over and engage me in debate about that. I lived in what eventually became, at first it was a sort of an immigrant neighborhood, but when my mother moved there in like 1956, I think she said, eventually by the the next year, it was by the first 1960, I guess, it was a predominantly African American neighborhood. And so, people would come to your house. We had all kinds of people in the neighborhood, doctors, lawyers, numbers runners, drug dealers, all kinds of people lived in that neighborhood. But they were all in a neighborhood where, the housing was better than some other areas, and they were coming from different places. They were also, many of them, part of the Great Migration, which I knew nothing about at the time, but they were coming from Tennessee or Mississippi or North Carolina, different places like that. And the neighborhood was like family. So as we were watching things happening on the news about the civil rights movement and such, neighbors would visit and actually engage people like me, the children, the young people, in conversation about Vietnam or whatever it was that was going on. So much was going on in that time. And so anyway, telling you all of that to say that by the time I got to college, my sheroes or heroes were like Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez, and I can't remember everybody's name at the moment, but many of those people that were involved, some young people, involved in the movement. And so when I was asked in this class that I was taking to bring my grade up to write something, I wrote prose. It was more like prose than poetry, but prose, but it had to do with, the things that we were going through, I was experiencing. And I did it in my very best Nikki Giovanni style. And so I brought it to class, and the way it would go is that the first thing you did was read it to the class. And then the professor would take it and you would get some kind of grade. So I read it to the class. The class loved it. Oh, this was just wonderful. And mind you, I was probably the only person of color in that class. But we were all young people kind of going through the same thing in a way. And so they really loved the poem. After the end of the class, the professor asked me to stay behind. And everybody else left. And when I stayed behind, he started telling me about Longfellow and Browning and so on and so forth. and that the language that I used in my poem didn't level up to that. I wasn't trying to write like them. I was trying to write like Nikki Giovanni. And the kids loved it, but the other students in the class loved it. And but he didn't, because I didn't have what he thought was the right caliber of vocabulary. And so he told me if I went home, he was giving me a B-. But if I went home and changed my words to something more on the line with the people that I just named to you, he would upgrade my grade. And so I agreed. I went home, I took my paper, and at the time, eventually I moved on campus and lived on campus. But when I first started there, because College Park wasn't far from where I lived, just get on a bus. But the campus was like a whole nother city, so walking around, they weren't like buses taking you from one end of campus or another. You had a bag of books, especially if you didn't have anywhere to live there, a bag of books and walking from one end of the campus to the other to get to different classes and everything. So anyway, I went home. My mom always had encyclopedias, Encyclopedia Britannica, the World Book of Encyclopedia, and thesauruses. She was a federal worker, which I eventually became myself, but she was a federal worker. So she had thesauruses and dictionaries and all of those kinds of things around. So I just grabbed one of her thesauruses, went up to my room, and without even much thought, I changed the words that he pointed out were not sufficient for him, and that on the level of Browning and Thoreau and all of those people. and I just picked words that had similar meanings to the words I had and replaced them that way without a lot of thought. And the next time we had class, he asked me to stay again after and wanted to see what I had done with my writing, and turned and told me how, people who write something the first time and think that they're good writers are not good writers. And so he read mine and said, well, I'll give you an A- for what you've done. And I really didn't do anything except change the words to words I know he was looking for, instead of the ones that were expressive of how I was feeling about what I was writing about. So anyway, that sort of discouraged me from writing. And so eventually, not immediately, but eventually I just sort of put the writing to the side and said, as also I was hearing from my family, you're going to starve, if you become a writer. And so I ended up in doing different things. As you mentioned in your introduction, for a while, for about 6 or 7 years, I worked at a hospital, Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C. as a unit manager on the floors. And eventually, because I knew I probably wasn't going to get very far doing that, I ended up going into the federal government. And the surprise for me in the federal government is that at some point I ended up in a job where I was responsible for what the federal government put out once a year for which was called the regulatory plan, and twice a year something called the unified agenda. And it was actually a book about the size of a old phone book, not the regulatory plan, that was smaller, but the other book was quite big, and usually about 5,000 or some proposed regulations that we would publish for the public to give comment. Most of the public knew nothing about those books. So there weren't a lot of comments coming in. Usually they came in from people who had businesses or professions around that particular topic that were interested in the book. But I became the senior person, the senior analyst around that project, and also having to give to think tanks who are outside of the federal government statistics on things that were happening and everything. And so anyway, at some point, I decided, okay, I'm ready to retire now. I think I retired in 2014. I'm not sure if that's exactly right or not. But anyway, around that time, I retired. And before that, they had a class in the federal, they still have a class in the federal government where they sort of prepare you for retirement. And one of the things they tell you is that you need to have something to do. You can't just go, rest. You have to have something to do. And I had started actually before retirement, because the first time I went, the class was offered like maybe 5 years before you retired. But this class happened to show up about 7 years before my retirement. And I started going, I think I went maybe 2 or 3 times to the class to just be reinforced with what I needed to be prepared for. And one of the things they said, that if you didn't have something meaningful to do, that you would die. So that's very literal. Like, if I don't have something meaningful to do, I'm going to die. But what they're really saying is the meaningfulness really doesn't have to do with whether you like it or not or anything. It has to do with it's something that keeps me going, keeps me being alive, keeps me at 70 years old now writing and wanting to talk to people about things.
Right.
And the thing is, as long as you have that kind of energy going on in yourself, the more likely it is you will live longer and survive longer. And actually, now that I've done it for some time, actually make a difference in the world, that you can You can
Absolutely.
see a difference in yourself, So that is one of the main things that has happened. And after going through the Shalem Institute to become a spiritual director, having gotten a spiritual director for myself for some years, this is even before retirement, and realizing how meaningful that experience was for me to get to know myself and to as Thurman would say, which came up later, for me to find the genuine in myself and to be true to who I really am. And my writing has a lot to do with that truthfulness as far as I'm concerned. And so those are the kinds of things that have gotten me now to 70 years old with a nonprofit that's been around for the last 14 years, 16 years, something like that. And because we actually started it before I retired, actually. And now a writer. And just yesterday, I received a note talking about walking the way of Harriet Tubman. I received a note from one of the people who runs not the Underground Railroad Museum, but there's a museum in Cambridge, which I think is mostly family or people who are somehow connected to Harriet, started a museum and place. And so they actually have in that, it's like a storefront, really. And they actually have in that place many things that are directly related to Harriet, in there. So just yesterday, I got a message via Facebook. She just happened to run across something on Facebook and said, I read your book. And I'm doing at this Harriet Tubman Museum that's in Cambridge, similar to what's written in your book. And I would love for you to come with me and present this to the people in Cambridge. So now I'm like really excited.
That's
I can't
excellent.
wait to,
Yes.
get into it.
So,
yes,
you've done so many things, since you retired or, before you retired. I mean, you're really, to me, like a role model entrepreneur. But let's talk about the latest book, the Harriet Tubman book. How did that come about? What led to that book getting published?
So being someone, it started with Howard Thurman, actually. My uncle, now deceased, was at one time, he and my aunt, my mother's older sister, had moved some time ago to New Jersey, and they adopted 2 children. And so they really had been in New Jersey by that point longer than they'd been in D.C., but both of them were from D.C., And so my uncle went to Howard University and made a friend there who was from Newark, New Jersey. And so as they were graduating, he decided to move up to that area. He didn't move to Newark, but he moved up to that area with my aunt. They had gotten married, and they were going to start an architecture business together. So my uncle, along with this person that he graduated from Howard Architecture School with at Howard, started an architecture business. Eventually, my uncle had his own architecture business there in New Jersey. I forgot what your question was. Tell me your question.
Well, how did you end up doing the Harriet Tubman book?
Okay, so it starts with Howard Thurman. So eventually, my aunt and uncle end up in a prison ministry up in that area with an Episcopal group, and they start going into the prisons in the area. And so they're asked to read Howard's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. So my uncle, who has always been one of the people who's encouraged me or challenged me to things, says, Therese, have you ever heard of Howard Thurman? And no, not really. Well, he has this book, and I'm going to give it to you to read. So this was early on, but I did read the book, and it impressed me. But then over time, he would talking to him, my uncle, about the book over time. And then eventually, as I started to form the Spiritual Directors of Color Network, I started reading Thurman again. And so my whole practice I'm talking about my personal practice now, was to really work on that, finding that genuine person in myself and what I felt genuinely called to, not so much about whether I was impressing anybody or anything like that, but where I really felt comfortable in being myself. And so that ended up with, first of all, going through the spiritual guidance program. And eventually my final paper was Black Spirituality and the Art of Spiritual Direction, that I wrote because there were no Black people teaching us or talking about our spirituality or anything like that. And so I decided, I liked a lot of what I learned with Shalane, don't get me wrong, but I still wanted to know how that connected with my own personal, my genuine experience in the world. And so I didn't have any big references. The only thing I think I knew about was Barbara Holmes' Joy Unspeakable. And there was another book that somebody wrote on spiritual direction in African American history. And then I'm slipping on his name. He was a historian and he worked at Howard. I can't think of his name. Albert Rabbitoe, that's who it is. So he had a book about slave religion. And so I started reading about 20 books, reading it, looking for something that would help to give me enough to write an essay about what it was like, spirituality and contemplative ways of being could be like from the Black experience. Mm-hmm. And I turned the paper in. We had mentors, and my mentor said that my paper was not contemplative. And so I pushed back and said, you take it to the director of this program, because she actually helped me find, like Thea Bowman, she helped me find some people to read about, to make these connections. And so I told her, you take it to her and let her see it and if she tells you it's not contemplative, maybe I'll try to write it again or write it over or something. And so I didn't hear from him about a week or two. And then when I finally did, he didn't call me or anything in person, but he sent me a note, which was a beautiful story about a pianist who was playing at Carnegie Hall or someplace, and he had written this beautiful piece. And as he played the piece, somehow he realized that the audience that was listening to him didn't receive it the way he intended it when he wrote the piece and as he played it. And that this is exactly what was happening to to the person who had read my, essay for my final paper for Shalane. And, but now he understood better. And so he was accepting my essay, and it was accepted by Shalane. I did graduate. and actually, I always, when I write, I have readers, people that I ask to just read for me to see what their impressions are. And so I had 3 friends who were reading for me. So, and I was telling them what was happening to me in this program, but they said, not only should you use it for your final paper, but I think you should publish this. This is what they were saying to me. So I went to Presence. I was just, initially getting involved with Spiritual Directors International. And so I went to the editor at the time for Presence and said I had this article, and I gave it to him, and they did publish it in Spiritual Directors International's Presence Journal, and which is not just in the United States, it's worldwide. So a lot of people have seen that paper now. And I've published 2 other articles in Spiritual Directors International, and the Spiritual Directors of Color Network has authored 3 books. The first one, there were 3 of us who were initial people bringing everybody together. We sort of edited together. The second book, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. I was the solo editor, but still we had, a group of people who wrote for that book. And that book won an award. And then the third book the editor was named as Anita Adesanya. A lot of people helped in that book. It's a great book. And one of the members who's now a board member of the Spiritual Directors of Color Network and I partnered together and wrote an essay, chapter 8, I think it was, which is about Howard Thurman and finding the genuine in yourself. So now I've written, I've done some essays in some magazines and journals and things like that. I've edited or somehow contributed to 3 books in our network. And then just out of nowhere, clear nowhere, it's been about 3 years ago now because something happened. The book was initially supposed to publish in 2022. And that was actually the 200th anniversary of Harriet Tubman. And some historians said, how dare me try to publish, this book. And so along with the editor who came out of nowhere, I didn't know her, but Broadleaf Books, who had just started, as far as I know anyway. And, they were looking for people to write for them. And they were in particular looking for people of color that they could add to their people who write. They asked me to write a book about anything. And so, okay, I think I'll write about Harriet. So what are you going to write about Harriet? I don't know yet. I'll get back to you. And the first thing I did was go to Amazon and look up books about Harriet. And I counted about 37 history books on Harriet. Wow. So I needed to write a history book about Harriet as much as you need to have a hole in your head. But the thing is, Harriet, connecting her, because I had already started connecting Harriet and Howard Thurman together. Much of what they thought was similar. And I'm thinking, I don't know this for sure, but my imagination tells me that Thurman's grandmother, who was enslaved, may have known something about Harriet, and or may have even had similar experiences to Harriet. And was saying, and she and Thurman talked a lot, so she may have even been saying things to Thurman, related to in some kind of way. So I started looking, but I couldn't find any books that really talked very deeply about her spirituality, except for one. There was one sort of like a children's book, but it wasn't even just Harriet. It was Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. So it was a thin book. So it was like a children's book. And so anyway, I've read, there were one book by Kate Lawson had just recently come out. And then Sarah Bradford, which actually is a member of one of the families that enslaved Harriet's family, had written a biography about Harriet herself. So I read those 2 books. And then because I just happened to get invited by the then who is now the executive for the Shalem Institute, if I would mind, gathering a group of people together and seeing if there were some pilgrimages that maybe some people of color might be more interested in taking. So, okay, why don't we all go to Cambridge and learn about Harriet? And so we did do that. It was a wonderful, and it just so happens that some years before I had been introduced to a historian who's in my area. He lives up in Germantown, Maryland, Tony Cohen. And he has actually walked the entire Underground Railroad over time. And so I decided to ask him if he might come. We went on a Friday and we came back home afternoon on a Saturday. We went to Harriet's, what used to be Harriet's church, on Sunday morning and then left for home. And anyway, Tony came on Sunday and took us through 3 counties of Western Maryland. showing us, the different places that different routes that Harriet took, and showing us her stories. My prologue in the book ends up being the story about how after we had seen some of this, we go to the Choptank River. And actually, it looks like a small town with just like a beach kind of area. And I don't know if you would actually swim in that water or not, but that's kind of what it looked like, And so Tony had collected in some bags some sweet gum pods. I don't know if you know what they are, but they're prickly. If you squeeze them in your hand, they hurt. And he gave us, each of us, a bag, and there were some other things in there too. But he asked us to put the sweet gum in our hands and squeeze our hands tight. And he started talking to us about the joy and the pain of life, and how the enslaved didn't have any shoes. They weren't given, and they weren't given shoes for a reason, because there were these kinds of things on the ground. So it would be painful, horrendously painful, to have to run for miles, to get to a river or something where there are alligators and snakes and all of these kind of things, and we're holding those things in our hand. And then he asked us to open our hands, and of course the pain is relieved. And so then to think about the joy we have in our lives. And for me, in that moment, I'm feeling like crying right now. But for me, in that moment, the pain that the enslaved went through, but also the joy of being in that place, and to have that kind of knowing, And so we go from there. We do that in a circle, a little ways away from the bank of the river. But then he tells us to walk down to the bank of the river. And we stay in one long line across the river, and he has us name our ancestors. And then we had a little cup, and we poured a little libation into the water as we named the different ancestors. And then we fell into silence. The first thing I said, when the editor had me change my wording a little bit, but the first thing I said when we walked down toward the river, it was a beautiful day. There was sunlight coming, and the river, there were like these lights. And this comes from George Bush, but you know how he talked about 1,000 points of light? That's what came to my mind. So actually my editor said, you can't use that, say something a little different. So I did. It's not that much different, but I said something other than quoting George Bush completely. But it was so beautiful, the light reflecting off the water. And then here we are. The sun is bright, but where we are, there are lots of trees too. And so it's not quite as bright, and it's warm that day. And we're standing there and we're naming our ancestors, and then we fall into silence. And all of a sudden the breeze picks up, the wind picks up, and it's like blowing toward us. And I can't help but think our ancestors are greeting us. Our ancestors are before us and greeting us. And I just stood there for a while, didn't know that I should say anything to anybody. And then I turned Tony, the historian, is standing next to me. So I kind of just turned to him very wide-eyed, and he nods at me, sort of like confirmation. Yes, I had that sense too. And we didn't have a conversation about it or anything, but that becomes the prologue in my book. And
wow.
And I think it has the picture of us at the Choptank River there too.
So what would you like people to take away from the book?
So the book is, again, a combination of Harriet. I call them the two HTs. Harriet Tubman and Howard Thurman is sort of a combination. I use Howard Thurman as one of the examples in what is called Harriet's Apothecary. So what an apothecary is, where they had all medicinals out of weeds and things, the things that Harriet was picking up out of the ground and giving to the babies so they wouldn't cry, or giving to someone when she was fighting for the civil Union soldiers. She would give them things to relieve their pain if she knew they were going to eventually die or something like that. And so in my book, I made my own Harriet's Apothecary, which was different people, not just Harriet or Howard. They're both there somewhere, but Maya Angelou or Toni Morrison or I can't think of everybody right now, but some people, just old poetry, from some people of color. Everybody's a person of color in the apothecary. And I either am telling something of their story, something of Harriet, something that they've written, and then asking people to meditate or contemplate on what they read. So like one of the things is to take a walk through your neighborhood and see how you find networks in your neighborhood and what's connected and what is the good that those networks do or something like that. But the whole idea in the apothecary is, after reading something of Harriet's story mixed with a little bit of my story, mixed with a little bit of just what's going on in the world right now, now here's your opportunity to take that and find the genuine in you. What are you being called?
Wow. That's very cool. That's wonderful. So, after all the different things you've done, and, writing the books, editing books, the spiritual director of color, the conference that you put together, what advice do you have for someone who's younger and just getting started to kind of go off on their own and seek out, their calling?
The same thing that I think the first step for all of us is to be true to who we really are. Don't try to do something because it's impressive to somebody else. And by the way, even if it is impressive to somebody else, it's also going to make somebody mad at you. Who are you to do this? So you have to, and all of those things point to the necessity for groundedness in who you really are. I have come to, I was raised Roman Catholic, and I've been to all kinds of churches, and now I'm officially Presbyterian, but everybody has like something missing from what they believe. I think everybody has a little bit of the truth, but not the whole truth. And the only truth that we really have to go on is what's inside of us. And so I believe, sort of like the Africans would put it, they call God, what we call God, they call the supreme being. And so they do believe that there's something that has caused all of this to be, but they don't look to that being to do everything else. That part of doing everything else is partially on us, human beings, and everything else that is on this earth, that we eat or, that we use for medicine or whatever. All of those things are here to help keep the planet, balanced and going on. Even earthquakes and volcanoes are creating land. And earthquakes are shifting the planet. Maybe that's what's needed to keep it afloat, All of those things are necessary. And so the only thing that is really necessary for us, I think the only thing that what we call supreme being or God or creator, the only thing that's necessary for us is to find those things within us that are there that have been given to us as part of who we are, and how we are to pour those gifts out into our communities and our creation and whatever else we are capable of doing. Everybody doesn't have to do the same thing. We need somebody to sweep the streets just like we need somebody to find a way to the moon or whatever. So, all of those things are necessary. And when we are really grounded in who we are, I think we're living what the Creator wanted for us.
Amen. Amen. Well, Therese, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate you spending some time with us. As I said before, you're such a role model to to watch what you're doing now at age 70 and all the things you've accomplished, over the years. It's just so wonderful to see. Again, I want to point everyone to Broadleaf Books. The new book from Therese is Walking the Way of Harriet Tubman, Public Mystic and Freedom Fighter. And it's a great book. So Therese, thank you again, and best wishes for all the other things I'm sure you're going to accomplish next.
Well, thank you, Brian, for having me. I appreciate it.